In this video, we are going to talk about biological concepts and what that has to do with the ocean. So here are the key concepts that we will go over, and I'm going to scroll through them quickly, and you can come back and pause and look at those later as necessary. So this chapter actually goes over almost an entire semester's worth of biology as a summary into one quick video. So I have a lot of links to other videos that you can go look at for more depth and a few activities that I'll point out along the way. So part of life is having these macromolecules, and there's four big macromolecules that are very key and important inside of our bodies. The first one is the carbohydrates, and then the lipids, like almost like the fat that you see here in this walrus. And then the proteins that make up our muscles, like this large fish that she's cutting here, the nucleic acids that make up our DNA. What's the harder one is to imagine carbohydrates in the ocean. So when you think about carbohydrates on land, maybe you think of rice or a potato or a piece of fruit, but it's harder to picture what carbohydrates look like in an ocean environment. But one example would be what you find in seagrass. So carbohydrates are made up of these carbons, hydrogens, and oxygens. And each of the hydrogens on these molecules is bound to the rest of the molecule by a little bond that has a lot of energy in it. And every single time you break off one of those hydrogens and you break that bond, you're releasing a lot of energy for the organism. So to have more of those hydrogen bonds, which carbohydrates happen to have a lot of hydrogen bonds on them, this is a high energy storage molecule. So monosaccharides are single sugars by themselves. And examples of those are like the ribose and deoxyribose that are in our nucleic acids, or glucose, and it's used as a basic fuel source for different organisms. A disaccharide is two sugars put together, so that's like sucrose or maltose or lactose. Another example on this slide of carbs in the ocean would be like mammal milk, or like plant plankton or seagrass that we saw in the last picture. So polysaccharides are actually when you have three or more sugars, and these are high energy molecules. So these can be like starches or glycogen or animal starch. You can have cellulose or chitin. So think of this like crab or different lobster. Their shells on the outside are going to be made up of chitin, and that is a type of polysaccharide that is a high energy carbohydrate. So also in the ocean, we have lipids, which are a type of fat, or you can have oils or waxes. They're also composed of carbon and hydrogens. And again, those hydrogens can be broken off for an energy source. They are used to store energy, to cushion the organism, the organs, or to keep the organism warm. And it's also used for buoyancy because it helps float. It's less than dense than water, so the organism with a lot of fat can float a little bit easier. It's also around on the outside of all the cell membranes, regulating what comes in and out of the cell membrane. And it's also steroids and waxes. So proteins are polymers of amino acids, and it's like these long chains of amino acids. And they function in a lot of very critical and important ways in our body. You can have it used as muscle or the connective tissue or enzymes to start reactions and keep them going over and over and repeating in your body, because enzymes don't get used up in the reaction. You can also have them used to transport or store different chemicals in your body. But here's a complete, or not a complete, this is just a list of some proteins in the body and what they can be used for. And note that they can even be used for keeping you healthy, like antibodies or toxins that you release, or that some organisms release, are made up of different proteins. There's also nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are often associated with DNA in your body and replication of genes, but they are also the RNA in your body. So DNA has this basic cool ladder structure, and if you break it apart, you actually have a nucleotide here that has a 5 carbon sugar along the outside. And then it is connected to a nitrogenous base here in blue and a phosphate group. So this right here is one nucleotide. And it is connected to another nucleotide here, and you'll see that it's connected in the middle by none other than more hydrogen bonds. And when you put a bunch of those together and twist it up, it makes the classic double helix. DNA is kind of, I almost think of it as being really reclusive. It has all of your genetic material and it has everything you need to make new copies of proteins so that that information can be passed down from one generation to the next. But it tends to hide out inside of the nucleus and just stay there instead of leaving and going and making that happen. So how does DNA replication happen and those genes get passed on? Well, thank goodness we have something called RNA, which is a sugar and a phosphate put together. And it actually, messenger RNA actually goes inside of the nuclear membrane and it visits DNA and it tells the DNA to unzip. And once it unwinds like this, then the messenger RNA floats around it and makes a quick copy and says, hey, just unzip for me, buddy. I am just going to make a quick copy of this here and then I'll be on my way and you'll be back together and be fine. Then it takes that copy and it goes, the RNA takes that copy and heads outside of the nucleus to the ribosomal RNA where it starts to make copies. And it's the transfer RNA that specifically is like the messenger boy that runs and gets the pieces that it needs. And that's how different proteins are made in your body. This is a video by Your Genome DNA Replication that goes into that in a lot more detail that I recommend watching. So our cells are capable of so many things. They have to have metabolism where they're digesting and have to have a whole energy source. They grow and then they also reproduce. Around the outside, all cells have a cell membrane. Inside of the cell, there is actually the cytoplasm. Cytoplasm is everything inside of the cell membrane, everything that you see here, even the organelles. And sometimes I think that's taught a little bit incorrectly. And the liquid part inside is specifically called the cytosol. There's a couple different types of cells. One is the prokaryotic cells. They are like bacteria, and yes, bacteria do exist in the ocean and they play a major, major role in the ocean. And then there's eukaryotes that are a lot more, we think of them as being a lot more advanced, but there's some cool things that bacteria can do too. But eukaryotic cells are covered in a membrane, and then they have these cool organelles on the inside. This is a video by Amoeba Sisters, the prokaryotic versus eukaryotic cell. It's a pretty simple video that breaks down what are the differences between those two different cell types. So inside our cells, there's lots of different things called organelles, and the organelles each play their own role. Like the nucleus contains all the DNA, the ribosomes, as we said earlier, makes protein, and then the endoplasmic reticulum has ribosomes in it and smoothie yard that makes fat. Some other organelle parts are like the Golgi apparatus that packages things and sends them off where they need to go. The lysosomes get rid of waste, but it's actually even more than that. They have some really cool features and functions, like they can destroy the whole cell if they find mutations that are not survivable and shouldn't be passed on. They have a really critical role in replication that way. There's also the vacuoles that sequester and hold waste, and they maintain a water balance. There's the chloroplasts that make food for plants, and mitochondria that make food for plants at night when there's no light around. And they also are in animal cells. This is our little energy mechanism for us. There's also flagella that help different cells move and flap and move, like you see here, or cilia that's closely related, that you would see more as like on the lining and a fixed like flagella where there's a lot of them in a row that are moving things along. If you are need a little more depth on your cell parts, here's a couple of really good cell games that you could play online that really quiz you on those cell parts if you need a little bit of a refresher on that. So the organelles inside of an animal cell are listed here along with some of their definitions, and a plant cell. Plant cells look a little bit different than animal cells in that a lot of times they are more structurally rigid because they have a cell wall on the outside. They have that cell wall because plants don't have a skeleton to hold them up, so they need more inherent structure around each of their cells, so they're not as soft as an animal cell. So that's one way you can kind of tell the two types of cells apart. Whereas an animal cell can look like this, and it can be a lot softer, but there's a lot of other shapes that it can have as well. So energy inside of cells comes a few different ways. For plants, it comes through photosynthesis. Every day the sun is giving plants a ton of energy. And plants miraculously use that energy to combine very, very low energy molecules like carbon, hydrogens, oxygens, and it will recombine it using the energy from the sun to make very high energy molecules like sugar. And this usually happens in the chloroplast, and then the thylakoid membranes actually trap the light energy that drives all of these processes and makes it happen. This is a video by Amoeba Sisters on photosynthesis that goes into that in a little more depth if you need it. In this slide, I show a little bit of a breakdown of what that looks like. So inside of, well, let's start here. A carbon dioxide and a water, if they go and head into carbon dioxide and water, and they are inside of the plant has brought them inside, the plant can use energy from the sun and recombine these two things to make sugar and oxygen. This is awesome for us because then we will go and eat that sugar and breathe in the oxygen in this part of the equation called cell respiration. And we will breathe out that carbon dioxide and make a little bit of metabolic water. Yes, you actually do generate a little bit of water every day, and that will go out and can recycle through the photosynthesis and cell respiration cycles. So energy inside of cells generally happens, it's called cell respiration, but that cell respiration generally happens in the mitochondria, and it's releasing energy from different food molecules. And the purpose for doing that is that it makes ATP, and it also ends up making CO2 as a waste byproduct of that. This is a video by Amoeba Sisters called Cell Respiration that goes into a little more depth on that. But now we are going to move on to cell reproduction. Cell reproduction is when a cell divides into two, and the most basic form of this can be called binary fission. This is literally when one cell replicates its genetic material and divides into two parts, and they're genetic clones of each other, and it's very simplistic how that happens. Most organisms actually have mitosis where they actually make a division of the cell material. And then there's a division of the different organelles inside of the organism, but this will also be sort of like a clone because this is of your body cells that you want to be similar each time. Here's a video by Daily Med Ed, Mitosis Made Super Easy. A very similar process to this, but there's one whole extra division is called meiosis. And while mitosis happens in our body cells, meiosis happens in the sex cells. So this is a video by Amoeba Sisters called Meiosis that I highly recommend that you watch to clear that up in your head. But the point is in meiosis is that in the end, you have half the amount of DNA that you originally had. And then the DNA from mom combines with the DNA from dad in order to make a new organism that has a mixture of both of the parents' original traits. So, when we're organizing life, we usually go to the most basic level of organization, generally, is on the cellular level. And you can have a single cell from an organism. When you have multiple cells put together, you have what's called a tissue. And tissues, basically, when you combine a bunch of tissues, say you have a muscle tissue or something like that, and that's a lot of different cells put together. Then you look at something like the eye of this organism. Well, it doesn't just have muscle tissue, it also has skin tissue, it also has nervous tissue. And so this is called an organ, and it has multiple types of tissues together. Then you can have an organ system. Say you have something like the circulatory system. Well, you can have like veins and the heart, and you can have capillaries, and that's all going to be a part, or the blood inside is all going to be part of an organ system. And when you have multiple organ systems together, then you get a larger organism that has all of those things together. So these organisms totally change over time by a process called evolution. And I think evolution is maybe taught incorrectly, where it's taught like these slow, super slow, gradual changes over time. But maybe if I can get you to think about it differently, my brain really sees it as more like a spreadsheet. If you were to take something like human eye color, and if you were able to really separate out every single human eye color down to the minutest variation, and you could get every single person surveyed on the planet and what their eye color is, and make sure that it was totally separated and they're all listed. And then you've got this spreadsheet, and at the bottom you can see the average of every single type of eye color on Earth. Then somebody dies or somebody's born, and we have to remove the deaths from that spreadsheet and add the births in. Well, that total on the bottom, based on the eye colors of the people that died and then the new eye colors that were born, those numbers at the bottom of the spreadsheet are going to change. And that's what evolution is. It's these fine little minute changes over time on the spreadsheet of every bit of DNA that we have out there. Those are evolutions. And the reason why I think it's been classified as like, well, it's really gradual over time, is because while the spreadsheet is going to pick up mathematically what those tiny little variations are, it's hard for us to physically see what those are over time. So I think if we can step back and maybe look at it as the spreadsheet, that is what evolution is. And while it's hard to visually see it, there are some changes that you can see over time. So when we talk about evolutionary biology, we talk about how an organism evolved, and then also what role are these different organisms playing in their environment. So one person that helped spearhead this idea and is given a lot of credit in this area is Charles Darwin. He traveled on the HMS Beagle for 5 years, and he was such a data head. He gathered so much data over time, specimens, logbooks, drawings. He was awesome at keeping records. And he basically was influenced by somebody named Charles Lyell, who was a geologist who believed, Charles Lyell believed that geologic changes were slow and continuous, and that the earth was very old. And because of that, Darwin started to conclude that as the earth had changed, that there was some changes with the animals over time that led to formulating the theory of evolution. So he developed a theory of evolution by natural selection, saying that the organisms that are best suited for their environment are going to live and reproduce, and those genes will influence that spreadsheet and make changes over time. One organism that you can tell has changed over time is the rockfish. In California, or on the western border of the United States, we have over 100 species of rockfish, and they are very, very diverse and different from each other. But you can tell that all of these species came from a common ancestors and long ago probably looked a lot more alike. A rockfish can live over 200 years. And you see these regularly when you're diving and snorkeling in California, but they don't breed until they're about 20 years old, which is really interesting. So this theory of natural selection is also seen by artificial selection. So artificial selection is when humans go and they breed new species because we want a certain trait to be like magnified in the gene pool. So we can force evolution to happen by having artificial selection, but this also happens a lot in nature when nature decides, hey, one is going to survive and one's not because one is better suited for their environment. This is a really cool fish called the cardinal fish, and it's able to spit bioluminescent bacteria for its own defense. So there's four basic premises of Darwin's theory of evolution. And one is, and look at these fish eggs while I'm talking about this, that more are going to be born than will actually be able to survive. And unfortunately for all these fish babies, they're not all going to survive. There was a lot more eggs laid than will actually be able to make adults. And each of these eggs has variation. They're each different from each other just a little bit, but some of them will be better able and adapted to survive. And because of that, they are going to be the ones more likely to reproduce. And also the environment, and I want you to look at this GIF over here of this reef. The resources in this reef are limited, and you can see how many different fish and different species are all fighting for the same resources. The resources are limited, and when food runs out or a predator comes around, some are going to be able to find ways to survive and others will not, and an evolution will occur. So, genes play a massive role in natural selection because that is where your traits exist on different alleles, and you receive one allele from each parent that makes up your traits altogether. However, some organisms actually bypass this altogether and say, forget sexual reproduction, we're just going to have asexual reproduction where we make exact copies and clones of ourselves. And here's an image of what that looks like, where one cell breaks into two, and it's basically they are identical to each other. Hydra do that, and you can see in this picture this one hydra budding off and making a clone of itself. Jellyfish have been known to do this. Some fish species will do this. They've even seen some sharks, which are a type of fish species, but they've even had some sharks in captivity where the female shark was the only one of that species. And eventually, by parthenogenesis, she will just create a baby using only her genes. And those sharks in captivity have occasionally had a baby, which is just crazy. So when you have genetic diversity, though, and you have two different parents, you will have like the sperm from the father fish and the eggs from the female mother fish, and those will combine to fertilize an egg. They will combine and give half of their total genetic material each to make one whole new baby. And this is really what that looks like in the drawing. And I would watch that meiosis video by the Amoeba Sisters for more help on this because this is going over it really quickly. But if the original cell had 4 alleles for a trait, when it goes through meiosis, a double division, the end product is that you'll have 4 babies in the end. Well, it doubles the amount of DNA here, but then splits again, so that the end product is 4 haploid cells in the end that have half of the amount of the genetic material. But then say this is the sperm, it will combine with an egg that also has half, making one complete organism with 4. So in genes and natural selection, population genetics, populations have organisms that are better adapted to survive, but organisms are limited to what is in their gene pool. Think about like a pod of orcas that is out and separated from other orcas. If they are not breeding with other pods of orcas, and say there's 100 of them left, then they are now considered their own species. Maybe they could interbreed with other ones, but because they're isolated, they don't. And that really does limit their gene pool, that they really have a hard time getting new genes in, except through mutation, getting new genes into the gene pool. So only individuals that have good combinations are likely to survive and reproduce. And in evolution, reproduction is success. The more you reproduce, the more successful you were evolutionarily. Here's two pictures of rockfish. And what's interesting about this picture is in all of the green spaces, these rockfish are nearly the same, but the blue dots are places where they are very, very different from each other. So even though they may look similar, they are different species. So the modern species definition is this: a species is one or more populations of potentially interbreeding organisms that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. If you copy and paste this definition, you'll find it all over the internet, because this has been decided upon that this is the modern definition of a species. That if species are isolated and make themselves separate and they won't breed with other ones, like the orcas that we talked about, then they are their own species. Even though they could breed with other orcas, because they are not, that makes them their own species. So some organisms are physically also incapable of breeding. Because their genes are so different from each other. So here's two different pictures of blue-footed boobies. So you can see here's the dance of the blue-footed boobies where they show off their feet, and we talk about this in the bird video. But as they show off their feet, they have a special dance where these two have a special dance that they made up that looks different than the dance of the other couple next to them. But say these birds come in contact with a red-footed booby. There might be lots of reasons why they can't breed and make fertile offspring. Not to mention that the red-footed booby lives in places like the Philippines, and blue-footed boobies live in places like Baja California and Central America and places like that. So there's different mechanisms that stop two species from being able to breed with each other. So one is having habitat isolation, where the two physically don't meet, like the Philippines and Baja California. They just physically don't meet. But then also you can have an anatomical isolation where the two birds might try to mate, but their parts don't fit together. And because their parts don't fit together, they can't actually have a baby. There can also be behavioral isolation, like the dance of the boobies, where one will have a certain dance or a certain song, and then one from another species will come up and be like, oh, that's not how we dance and sing. I am not interested in you at all. And so because one behaves different than what the other one is used to, that can be a behavioral isolation. Another thing that can prevent breeding is having what's called temporal isolations, where the two organisms just simply breed at different times of the year. So maybe you have a female and a male together that are closely related, but it's April and she is not able to breed until May. And so because of that, their breeding just doesn't work. You can also have situations where the sperm can't penetrate, for example, the egg. So maybe the sperm runs or swims and gets up to that egg, but it's bouncing off that egg. So we actually see this in Southern California with the red and purple sea urchins in Southern California. They both release their sperm and eggs at the same time in the water column. So, but the eggs can't be penetrated by the sperm of the wrong species. You also can have post-fertilization, like the sperm made it into the egg, but then when the DNA of the sperm and the egg line up, it is incompatible. So even though the sperm made it into the egg, that egg did not produce an offspring. Or you can sometimes have it where the sperm makes it into the egg, but then the baby that is formed is infertile or really weak or doesn't survive very long after it's born. One hybrid that's been made recently is a sturgeon bester breed. It's a type of sturgeon fish. Sturgeon fish actually are used for caviar. So in the Ukraine and in Russia, different scientists thought it would be a good idea to make a hybrid sturgeon that makes a ton more eggs so that they could use them for caviar. And so they bred this hybrid. This hybrid is working out, but you can imagine like the environmental disaster this would cause if this was ever released into the wild to breed with other things. Here's a video by 2 Minute Classroom, Speciation and Prezygotic and Postzygotic barriers that talk about all those barriers to reproduction that I just went over. So sometimes you have something called allopatric speciation, where the two species end up just being separated from each other and become different species over time. So a long time ago, more than 4 million years ago, the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean were actually joined together, and organisms could freely move between the two. But eventually, about 3 to 4 million years ago, the landmass of like Central America was there, and these cowries, there was one species of cowrie before, but this species of cowrie actually ended up speciation and breaking off to two different species. So the one in the Caribbean is now called the measled cowrie, and the one in the Pacific is called the little deer cowrie. If you bring these over to meet up with each other, they can no longer interbreed when they could long ago, just because the spreadsheet changed far enough that they can no longer make fertile offspring. This is a video by Amoeba Sisters on speciation that goes into more detail on how two species become different species. But I really, really like this video too, because it goes over some ocean organisms like shelled snails that we just talked about, science animated snails evolving into new species on the seashore. That's really good. So once we have all these species, we like to classify them and give them names. Here's two different species of butterfly fish next to each other, but we like to order all of these different things. So early schemes just had all living things as plants or animals, okay? But modern classification takes the categories from domain. Then it's broken into kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and then the species. The three main domains are the archaea, eubacteria, and eukarya. And then from there, the kingdom of eukarya is broken into three more parts called the fungi, the plantae, and the animalia. So those are the three kingdoms: the fungi, the plantae, and the animalia. And we are going to talk a lot about those in future videos, but a lot of scientists still use what's called a cladogram or a cladogram to order all of these living things. So when you're looking at a cladogram, you can see that all of these things, when it says there's a common ancestor of all living organisms right here, that means that all of these organisms up the line do at least have this one trait, okay? But if you head further up the line, you'll see there's a common ancestors of all eukaryotes right here. The organisms down below from here will not have this trait, but everything after this point on the line will have the trait. You can also see when you look at these some type of relationships or how closely related some things are, like this protista and this plantae are very closely related, and then this plantae is less related to something way down the line like this bacteria, or way down the line or up the line like the fungi. Here's two really good videos that explain this and go into more detail. One is a video by Professor Dave Explains, Cladistics Part 1, Constructing Cladograms. And then here's another one, if you liked their other videos, by the Amoeba Sisters on classifications. So I told you ahead of time that was going to be like an entire semester of biology all in one video. I know that was a lot of information about how all biological concepts relate to the ocean. I hope you learned a lot of new things and gained better appreciation about how the inner workings of biology are happening in our oceans.